Nancy and David, could you address something which is the relationship between the Bureau of Prisons and the public corporations, or Correction Corporation of America and all, in relational to the reforms you're talking about, what your view is of how they're doing at addressing these problems or how they aren't, and what that relationship is, because the perception, I believe, of the public and certainly Wall Street is that the more people that are in those prisons, the better the bottom line is, which is totally counter to the argument that we're all here to talk about.
Well, just real briefly, the Colson Task Force did look at the issue of private prison use by the Bureau of Prisons. What we found was that those were just absolutely not cost effective. They were much more expensive than the prisons run by the BOP. There are other potential issues involved in being able to monitor whether people in private prisons are getting access to the types of treatment and program that they need to successfully reintegrate. But getting back to the bottom line, it just makes no sense. And, we were so pleased when, one of our recommendations was, as the prison population begins to decline, this is the first thing you should do. You should close those private prisons. And then, I don't know, maybe a month or two later, BOP signaled that they were going to do exactly that. It wasn't that big a victory. It was, again, about dollars and cents. But now, with this new Sessions memo, the numbers will be increasing, not decreasing. And there'll be a reason to start using those private prisons more so. And, someone's making a buck on this, many people. I won't venture to say who.
And let me take that on, too, because I'm going to have a view that's, I suspect, radically different than most people in this room, and that is, I think the issue of private prisons is largely a red herring, cost notwithstanding. Look, anytime that you have a expanding population, it is always better to not focus your resources on sunk costs, but rather go and if you're manufacturing, buy things that you need rather than build the manufacturing facility, right? That's a terrible example, I'm first to admit, but contracting out when you have some marginal requirements makes economic sense. That said, shrinking the prisons or the inmate population should result in the first contract or the first things to be canceled being the private prison contracts because they're so expensive. But where I would direct a lot of people to consider or think about is this. I am less worried about whether that guard is a private sector guard or a public sector guard. And I am more worried about the rules that guy has to work within and the resources that facility is providing to the offenders. Whether, this is mixing my metaphors a little bit, but if I'm looking at going to Angola versus going to a Corrections Corporation facility, I know what one I would prefer. I mean, there's some really horrific, particularly state prisons out there. And they're run by public servants. So I think it's a distinction that is often kind of glommed onto to say, oh, that's why they're doing this because they have stock in Geo, right? Come on, anybody that's been up on the Hill knows that's not what goes through people's minds. That at the end of the day, we need to look at the services and the outcomes of each individual facility. And let me just jump on this because this is the other part is, I find it incredibly ironic and really a little nauseating that the Bureau of Prisons, at least as of last year, had no measurement to determine what their recidivism rates were. The Inspector General's report from November, I believe, said BOP doesn't track recidivism. There are other organizations and other statistical methodologies out there, and Nancy, maybe you can back me up on this, but at least according to the IG for the Department of Justice, BOP didn't track recidivism. And so the question I have is, how can we measure whether it's a private sector prison or a public sector prison that's performing well or performing horribly if we don't know what the recidivism rates are?
I just want to say one thing about the family point because I don't think we made it clear, just as a factual matter, so people know. The rule that the BOP has, and it's not a hard and fast one, is 500 miles, but it's 500 air miles as the crow flies. So that's why somebody like David could be at Devens in Massachusetts, even though he lived in Virginia. When I was in Cumberland, Maryland, I had guys who lived in Rhode Island. So if you drew those 2 points on a map and measured, they were within 500 miles. But in terms of driving miles, it was 10, 12 hours. So they effectively didn't see their kid. So one of the things we're talking about, and very modest reform, would be at least to enforce the 500-mile rule as a driving miles as opposed to an air miles rule. But what we found, and part of this can't be fixed because of the prisoners from Puerto Rico or from Hawaii, there's some facilities there's not enough space, in our survey, half the people who responded were more than 500 miles. Now, that was the selection we got. Nancy and the Colson Task Force found it was less, but it was still like 25%, I think, were 500 miles. And that is a long way. And it's destructive to families. So, I mean, in terms of concrete suggestions, one thing we think Congress could do, and with BOP's help, is make that distance a little shorter.
Another thing they could do, which we recommend in the Colson Task Force report, is to provide more access to video conferencing. It's not a substitute for the
I was
real
going to say,
thing.
that's what I worry about. Isn't there some talk that some prisons are using video conferencing as a substitute?
Oh, I'm not aware of
Okay.
that, but I would never recommend that.
And I've seen some of those legislative proposals out there that say, more video conference. My suspicion is that management at each individual facility would say, this is great because now we don't have to run visitors hours. And there ain't nothing that substitutes for the hug from one of your kids or from a kiss on the cheek from your wife when you're in the joint.
And that was something that I wanted to add. And David just said, it's the power of the touch. To get a hug. This is one of your senses that you need. And without having that to be a part of you, it can grow you into more of a disconnect from the human reality that we have. To have your daughter or your nephew, your niece, your mom, or someone to age on you, because I lost both of my parents while I was incarcerated. So to see them age on you over a video camera versus someone coming into a visiting room to hug you is tremendously different. So a video camera, you need to be touched when you are incarcerated. If you have a wife, if you have a significant other, if you have children that are growing up, they need to feel you. Even if you made a mistake, even if you broke the law, all of that is fine, but you're still human. So and through all of that, you have to be touched, because if you don't be touched, what happened is to start making you into really, in so many words, a disconnected monster. And when you come out, you cold. When you come out, you've lost your feelings. And all of these things I have experienced by being around men who have not had a chance to touch. So I just had to share that, and the importance of this 500 miles and the importance of staying in contact with your human existence.
Yeah, it's really important just practically for families to try and come visit you. I had a good friend who is now my wife who would drive 8 hours to come visit, would visit for 8 hours, and drive home for 8 hours. So it took a lot of dedication to get people to do that. And what happens inevitably is the longer you serve, the fewer and fewer people you're connected to, the fewer people that want to come visit you. And Norman's right. Once you get to the point where you are no longer tethered to the outside world, that's when trouble hits. That's when people get consumed by the prison world and they aren't thinking about getting out. They aren't thinking about how to make themselves better today so that when I get out, I have success. And that's why visits and community is so important. Almost everyone I've seen of my friends that got out and had success is because they got out and were with a community, whether that's social justice activists, church, school, education, you name it. If they had community, they were less likely to commit new crimes because they didn't want to let down the people in that community.
And perversely, the prison rules actually work to deprive these guys who are coming out of those supportive networks. not just from the family side, but from the mentoring side, right? So I saw guys that would build up mentor relationships with volunteers, particularly religious volunteers that came into Devon's. And they would learn to trust, they would learn to get advice and take wisdom. And then once they were out of Devon's, guess what? Those volunteers were not allowed to talk and continue those relationships with the guys that are out, which makes absolutely no sense. There's no security threat there. But so the guys that get out have taken the time to build these supportive relationships while oftentimes their family relationships are withering, and now they walk out alone. And it just makes no sense. It is no wonder that so many return back. It's totally predictable when you look at it.
So, Mr. Sasabian, you said that the issue is that we need to find out what works. And in my opinion, the issue is that when we have stock in prison, when we have people making capital, when we have profit being based off something as problematic as incarceration, we really do need to figure out what is working, what is not working. Now, you said that we need to find some way of measuring what's working with private versus public. You mentioned recidivism. Well, I see recidivism as the latency to rearrest. So why can't we measure that? And what steps are we taking to measure?
Oh, I think recidivism is measurable. Don't get me wrong. Please don't think that I'm saying it's not a measurable data point. It's just that BOP hasn't gone out of its way to measure.
What steps can we take to measure recidivism and realize what it is?
Well, the easiest one is Congress could mandate that every BOP facility by facility measure in the intake questionnaire, have you ever been convicted of a crime before, right? And then to publish those statistics. Because if you publish them, guess what? Now we can hold all those administrators and wardens accountable for the programming that they are or aren't providing to their folks. But they don't do that. And the other part is, I would argue that Congress could require a report of the number of volunteers that are certified to come in on a facility by facility basis, so that we can hold those that bring the most volunteers in accountable, or laud them, and hold the ones that kind of poo-poo it and don't go out of their way to bring volunteers in, hold those guys accountable too. Bring in the top three and the bottom three performers for every classification of facility and say, why can you do it at facility X, but you can't do it at facility Y? Because there's a link between volunteers and the type of programming and mentoring that people get that helps support them when they get out. But nobody's done that, and BOP hasn't done it.
Performance-based measures are something that the criminal justice system vitally needs. Private prisons, just on their own, aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's the contracts that are bad. If they actually incentivize prisons and said, we're going to assign contracts based on recidivism rates, the lower your people coming out, your recidivism rate is, the more contracts we're going to give you. Private prisons could actually be a very good thing. It's just right now, no one looks at performance and holds wardens and administrators at these various prisons accountable, public or private. And so private prisons gets a lot of talk, but I'm telling you, on the rung of things that need to be fixed, it's far below changing sentencings and reforming prisons across the board, at least in my eyes.
Well, and bonuses could also be tied on a facility by facility basis to what their recidivism rates are.
What can we do, or what sorts of programs do you guys suggest that we implement within prisons to go past well-being? It may not be business management in AA, but where's the middle ground?
So another recommendation we have is to align the types of vocational training options to what's out on the job market, and to be pretty specific about it. So understanding the skills and education level of each and every person in federal prison, and understanding too, and something often overlooked, is that every single person in federal prison has some collection of assets, something to bring to the table. I feel like we in the criminal justice world are always talking about risks and needs and, the bad stuff, but, most everyone has strengths, assets, skills, talents. So figuring out what those are through, a careful case management process, and then finding out where they're likely to be released to and what the job market looks like. This is done in other sectors, and it makes good sense. But what we saw was that there's very little access to vocational training, and that which was offered was, I don't know, we saw a recycling center. I guess that's relevant. I mean, recycling happens. But, it didn't seem like it was very strategically delivered in a way that would help people succeed.
And part of the problem is occupational licensing schemes basically wipes out a whole swath of professions for people that get felonies, law included. I'm one of the few people that have a law license after having served time in prison and having committed felonies. There are a whole bunch of professions. From some states, it's interior decorating. You have to have a license, and if you have a felony, we can't let you because you may cause some risk of threat to the public service or public security. If you are a licensed interior decorator, some places, I know Chicago for a while had a licensing scheme that stopped people from cutting hair, which barbering is a big industry in prison, and that's something that people can learn in prison and get out and be successful at. So part of it is we need to train people in prison, but the other piece is we have to quit banning people with criminal backgrounds from huge swaths of vocations and career paths.
I would add one other facet to this. That is, we are the technology leaders of the universe. How many people have the ability to use the internet to go build their educational portfolio, right? Why do we need to have a caseworker to tell us, well, you should be in welding, or you should be in plumbing, or you should be in gardening? Why do we even have to make the distinction between vocational ed and higher ed? If we're providing these guys with the opportunities to learn and we're giving them the right guidance, they should be able to say, I'm good with my hands, I want to learn X. Or I'm good with my brain and I want to go into business and I want to learn Y, and I can get that pipeline of information and instruction from the internet. It's the only place I can imagine where the internet doesn't seem to provide any benefits to this community, and it makes no sense. It is old ways of thinking that are not reflected in reality.
One of the recommendations, the idea of giving federal prisoners tablets and putting educational materials on those tablets for them in prison. Wonderful idea. I don't know why they have not done that, because that could be a real breakthrough for a lot of people who want to go into various careers. The education would come through the tablet rather than BOP having to let people in to come teach classes.
And that's a real thing. There are state prison systems that are experimenting with tablets, and it's a great model because it's both delivering all the content, but you can build in incentives. So if you get through this module, if you get all the answers right, then you get to play a game. And so then that's a very easy incentive to get people to engage.
And what would be great is if we could get people that have been directly impacted and incarcerated, providing some of the educational materials. I have a good friend who's named Michael Santos. He did a long time, like Norman, 26 straight years for a nonviolent drug offense. While he was in prison, he earned 3 degrees, became a millionaire through the stock market, published 4 books, and was a blogger from the Huffington Post, all from federal prison. And now he has educational materials that show other prisoners exactly the path that he took to improve himself. And he's actually, in some states, are buying these materials and putting them on tablets for other prisoners to see. And again, I think that could have a huge impact if we did it more globally.
My question is for the whole panel, and actually I have 2. The first being, do you all think that prisons have too much discretion in terms of what programs are allowed to the prisoners? And secondly, why do you all think that laws that discriminate against minorities and are proven to be ineffective continue to be passed and stay intact?
I'll take your second question first, which is why do laws that disproportionately impact people of color, why are they staying in place? And the answer is, I don't know, but it's the biggest. I mean, you cannot talk about the criminal justice system without talking about race. It's involved in everything from policing, to the front end policing, and the adversarial system with trials and plea bargaining, all the way through sentencing and then prison and reentry. And it's ever present, and it's something we as a society have to tackle. But I don't see a great indication that we're ready to do that yet, even though a lot of people have come to the realization we need to tackle it as a society as a whole. We just aren't ready to, and for what reason, I don't know. But it's something that if we don't fix, you can't fix the criminal justice system without talking about race.
Well, the first question was about,
The wa- yeah. Yeah.
well, I usually don't think discretion is a bad thing
Yeah,
if they use it well. The question is, what incentives do they have to offer programming? And that, I think, is the problem. If you're measured by nobody escaped today, then you don't have to worry about things like giving people furloughs to spend time with their families so that when they get closer to leaving, they're not going crazy, which a lot of guys do when they've served long sentences. I mean, there's things you could do, and if you gave these guys some discretion, that you could really test. And as we've been talking about, getting measurements and then judge them by whether they do that. How many public sector and private sector partners do they bring on the campuses to do job training or do educational programming? And does that work? What is their employment rate after leaving their compound? So I am for them having discretion. I wish the BOP, like in this environment where I don't expect broad reform, would at least do some pilot programs to try different things. So I'm for discretion. I just think there's got to be incentives to use it wisely.
And we've certainly saw a lot of discretion across the federal facilities, and a lot were just based on the leadership of each institution. And some leaders were really open to offering more programming, bringing in volunteers, faith-based entities, and so forth. And others were just philosophically not open to that. So discretion is good, but I think also, to your point, incentivizing innovation and looking at outcomes, performance metrics that really matter is really important.
Yeah, let's call it what it is there's a cultural problem within the BOP. And the cultural problem in the BOP is this, that and Kevin touched on it, the only performance measure that matters is how many escapes or how many violent incidents have you had in your facility, all right? And because of that, it rewards the status quo, and it rewards managers being passive rather than really trying to figure out what's the right solution for each individual case that they have. And so only through better performance metrics, better incentives on the management side, as well as incentives for these guys to take the courses, are we going to see real change from the BOP side of things.
Yes, thank you. You had mentioned earlier the states, and I have two sort of questions related to that. First, are there any states that serve as good models for addressing the various issues that you discussed today? And two, are there any lessons when it comes to advocacy or promoting these strategies that would take from the criminal justice efforts at the state level that might be applied federally?
I would be giving you complete anecdotes if I answered that, because this survey we did is of federal prisons. I hear states that do well, have had success, but I can't tell you what their programming was, whether, how that's been tested. So does somebody else want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I keep referencing the Colson Task Force. But that was, something that Congress appropriated to make happen in large part because they saw all the successful reform efforts that were happening across the country, state by state, mostly Republican-led states that were engaging in real reform, sentencing reform, and for the most part, also looking at what was happening behind bars in terms of programming, introducing risk and needs assessments. All of those examples tend to fall under the heading of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative that we at the Urban Institute have documented extensively. And there's a wide array of success stories that the BOP and the federal government could be looking to and adopting.
Yeah, but I think the takeaway, broadly speaking, and I won't cite specific statistics because they're lies and damn lies and statistics, right, is that if you look at where the states have embraced some of the reforms that FAM stands for, that ACF stands for, that everybody on this panel believes in, whether it is using incarceration only to the extent necessary to teach a lesson and not having these draconian measures, getting rid of mandatory minimums, providing some of the cost savings for programming, making some distinctions between violent and nonviolent offenders in terms of length of sentence and treatment. You look at states across the country and the performance can't be argued against. I mean, Congressman Scott talked about Texas, right? Texas keeps closing prisons. You look at, we were just looking at statistics in South Carolina. South Carolina did modest reforms, and they saw a drop in recidivism rate, they saw a drop in violent crime rate, they saw a drop in property crime rates, and they saw a drop in inmate numbers, all at the same time. So, you know, we opened up this discussion with, you know, this is the one bastion of federalism that for some reason Republicans and Democrats alike don't tend to follow. Well, it's the states that are the laboratories here, and they're showing demonstrable, measurable, and unassailable progress in what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. When do you guys think that those programs should be implemented? I don't know what the Uber program, I don't know when they're being implemented now. But should it be like 2 years before you have to get out, a year, months, or when do you think starting this program will be more effective?
Well, I'm going to let Nancy talk about a little of this, but I think we're in agreement on this. I think we all agree that when you get to prison, you should sit down and a plan should be developed based on your risks, needs, and skills and assets, as she said. And that plan that you develop should chart the rest of your time during that sentence. You'll know how long you're supposed to be there and what's available and what would suit you best. It should start on day one. BOP has as its motto, reentry starts on day one. That's laughable. Part of the problem, even with the RDAP program, which is the drug treatment program that works, you get that at the end of your sentence. So you have guys who don't beat their addiction and their bad thinking until the end of their sentence. So they're the guys smoking K2 in the lobby or doing things that they shouldn't be doing because they haven't even gone through coursework that they're eventually going to get. And then in terms of job training programs, the question about what other things could be done. There are some good programs in prison. There are HVAC apprenticeships, plumbers, commercial driver license. There are some of those things that exist. They're just in short supply. And so expanding those would let people take advantage of them throughout their whole sentence. But it should start on day one. I only laugh because that's what BOP says it does, and it doesn't.
And part of the problem is the length of the sentence. Think about if you're 20 years old and you got a 20-year mandatory minimum. How enthusiastic are you going to be about seizing the day and making yourself better when you have a sentence that's as long as you've been alive? It's just really hard when the light at the end of the tunnel is barely visible. It's hard for people to get their mind wrapped around, I need to make myself better today for when I get out 20 years from now. And I definitely went through that. The first couple of years I was in prison, I didn't really, I was in and amongst doing things I shouldn't have been doing and still thinking like I thought when I committed the crimes. And the reason was I didn't want to think about when I go home because that seemed so far off in the distance that I didn't even want to think about preparing myself for that day because I didn't know if I was ever going to make it there. And so part of the way we reform people in prison is by not giving them these really long sentences to begin with. A much more manageable sentence, people are much more willing to take programs and start preparing themselves if they know they're going to go home in a few years.
And I totally agree. But one thing that we have to do is because everyone, what I would call catches on fire at their own time. So let's try to have the classes available. Like Kevin said, BOP talks about, it starts the day you get there. Well, that's true. But if you keep it in context, and what I mean by let's make it available the day you get there, because everyone goes through their transition at different times. It all depends on the moment you mature, the moment you get tired of the old you and you want to become a new you. So let's just make it available for the moment we get there, and then let the person decide when they want to get in their transformation. That's going to be hard. Let's just try to make it available for the moment you get there is the moment you catch fire. That's what I would suggest.
Just to echo other comments, two things. One, the focus group that I helped facilitate was at one of the camps. There must have been at least 15, 16 fellows around the table. And I said, can I just see a show of hands? How many of you have participated in any kind of reentry programming? Not a hand. And yet, all through the tour, the BOP was saying reentry begins at day one. I mean, it was comical. It truly was. I have to believe that they sincerely believe that on some level, but unless you make good on that by offering the programming, it's meaningless. The other thing I will say is, as the kind of resident researcher at the table, we searched far and wide. We could not find any research that said that a 10-year sentence gets you more than a 5-year sentence, or certainly not a 20-year sentence versus a 10-year sentence. These sentences are longer than I think anyone really stops to think about unless you've lived it. We at the Urban Institute are releasing a very interesting report, and it's going to be a feature that you can play around with online. It's the long sentences study, and we kind of document all the ways that long sentences affect people's lives and all the things that happen when you're behind bars, things that you've experienced, losing parents, seeing kids graduate in a way that we hope will contextualize it for the general public, many of whom just think the longer the better. August.
Okay. Oh, you go ahead.
I served 26 years in federal prison, so I consider myself an expert on how it's operating and ran. The problem with the recidivism rate is the education. If we want to fix recidivism, we have to educate. We have to get education back in the system, as Norman was touching on. The Pell Grant. When we lost the Pell Grant out of the prison system, we lost a lot of great things because we used to compete with each other to try to make the dean's list. These are prisoners, and someone gave Congress the idea that you're making the prisoners smarter, that you're going to have these super criminals that's going to come home that's going to be smarter. No, what you're going to do is you're going to educate a young man who didn't have no guidance, and he's going to realize that there's other means and methods to get the things that he wants out of life. That he can go with an education. There's so many things that he can do. He'll learn and know that he can get that training that you're talking about, the HVAC program, the plumbing. He'll know these things from educating him from the education. We used to have professors come into the prisons. I'm talking about maximum security prisons. We had professors from Kansas University, from Penn State University coming in and teaching us. And these prisoners was willing to learn. I was serving a life sentence. I was serving a parolable sentence, but I served 26 years for a crime I didn't commit, which is another story. But it didn't deter my drive to better myself. I wasn't there. I wasn't expecting. I didn't know that I would win parole one day when I went in the door. But we found out that education is what works. There was statistics out of North Carolina that showed that a person who obtained a GED reduced the recidivism rate. Only 2 people who obtained a GED ever came back to prison in North Carolina. We showed Congress that a person with a degree is 70 times less likely to come back to prison than a person who doesn't. That's how you fix the recidivism rate. And the reason why the Bureau of Prisons will want you to think that their system is available to you and it's working, because they have all this stuff in their orientation booklets that's on paper, that's in writing, but not being readily enforced. And we have to understand that when you're in a law level security, the law of security, they are inclined to push reform to a more degree. But when you're in maximum security prisons, they're not talking about reform. There's not, they don't expect these guys to ever come back home. And so I myself was a victim of what they call diesel therapy. I went to 18 different, I was transferred 18 different prisons in the course of 26 years in the federal system. I was with Norman Brown as well in a number of different places. So I can attest to you that the thing that they're doing for recidivism, if we want to fix it, we have to get the Pell Grant back into prison. We lost the Pell Grant because no voice was there to represent us in front of Congress when this officer was talking about how he jeopardized his life every day to risk to put these guys, these monsters, away from prison, and his daughter couldn't get the Pell Grant. We didn't have nobody to tell the guy, this officer, the reason why you can't get this Pell Grant and these so-called monsters can get it is because you and your wife make too much money. That's the reason why you couldn't get the Pell. Your daughter wasn't eligible for a Pell Grant. But if you allow these guys to get an education and they find out all the things that they didn't know. I graduated when I was 17 years old. I had to go all the way to prison to realize that I didn't know a damn thing. I had to re-educate myself all over again. And I did this through prison, through the system of the Pell Grant that we had working for us. We also try to get Congress to understand and see that the mandatory minimum sentences didn't work. And the reason why they don't work is because while you're sending these prisoners to these private prison industries, what's not being told is that you're still on the count in these little rural county places where we had these private prisons. You're on their census, so they're benefiting from the prisoners being under their sentences. So that helps their population. So it's not in their best interest to try to get recidivism to stop. But I know the FAM agenda is to stop recidivism, and the way we stop it is to educate.
It's not just that the BOP doesn't have programs for education. It's that they don't have programs for education, and for the people that do want to get it on their own, they actively discourage people. So Michael Santos is an example. He tried to get a PhD, a doctorate's program, and the warden at the prison he was at, stopped it and said that it was a security risk for him to get a PhD program. Now, Michael would tell you that the reason the warden did it was because if Michael got a PhD, he would have more education than the warden did. And I went through the same thing. I had a GI Bill from my days in the Navy. I tried to take correspondence classes, but I had to go beg, and it was only for the grace of a female guard that worked in the education department that volunteered to grade my exams. That was the only way I got to take higher education in prison. So not only does the BOP not provide programs, a lot of times they actively discourage it.
I just want to say we're going to wind up. So one, thank you for the plug for Pell Grants. That's in our report, is to reinstate Pell Grants. I was on the Hill when they were taken away. I remember the debate. And you're right, there were no advocates for prisoners there. We also took away weightlifting equipment and all these other things that sounded so great at the time, really short-sighted. I want to say one thing. There has been legislation introduced to reform both sentencing and prison reform. And part of the reason FAM did this report is because we don't want reforms that actually make things worse or that exacerbate certain disparities that exist today. And so, for instance, there's the Corrections Act, which is Senator Cornyn's bill on prison reform. I just think it's really important to note that of the 4 former federal prisoners sitting here today, none of us would have qualified for the incentives that program offers for people to participate in programming. we committed the wrong type of offenses for Congress. So I had honest services fraud, David's obstruction, Sean's is a violent felon, and Norm's got too many criminal history points. So honestly, I would have been fine if I wasn't given incentives. I have a law degree. I was serving a short sentence. I was just trying to make the time pass. But the guys who need programming the most under the legislation that's being offered are going to be denied it because of the types of crimes they committed. It's really a short-sighted and stupid decision. So it's important that not only that we get reform, but that it's smart reform. Having said that, you guys have been very patient. It's been long. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks to everyone from FAM who helped put this together. And stay and ask questions afterwards if you want, but thank you.